So, that being the case, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open up the floor for a general Q&A and discussion. And feel free to leverage your questions to a particular member of our August group, or simply to open it up to the floor, and we'll take it from there. Don't be shy. I'll call on you. Yes, sir.
I think one of the things that has not been focused on in any of this discussion is why would any two people or any two groups of people agree on any social norm? And the fact of the matter is, I think the only legitimate mechanism is that there is some shared positive utility that is derived from that norm. Now, Patricia made the explicit comment that it's absolutely absurd to imagine that the maximizing of things like shared social norms is going to automatically come about. Can I ask the question, how can the neuroscience that the group of you are developing shedding light on the limits of that shared agreement evolving? Specifically looking at that, I asked the question before about how we can become a unified tribe of the whole and get away from the conflicts that are built into tribalism. And I think this dimension of creating these shared social norms is basically the enterprise of humanity. And you all have various deep insights on exactly what are the nuts and bolts of doing that.
Who'd like to take this first?
Well, yeah. I'll try to be brief. I mean, shared social norms are not seen only in humans. So in other social mammals, and let's just talk about primates, baboons, chimpanzees, bonobos, but let's also talk about wolves. There are certainly social norms, and when they are violated, there is a consequence to pay. And it's fairly easy to see why those norms are there in terms of the welfare and the stability of the group. So exactly how those norms arose and how they're modified, and we know that they can be modified because different baboon troops have somewhat different social practices. And different wolf packs have somewhat different social practices, and it of course reflects to a degree the existing condition, ecological conditions. How that problem solving works such that they gravitate towards this social practice rather than that, and how it is that social practices get modified on the fly, so to speak, is not of course well understood. It's not well understood in other primates, and it's not very well understood in humans, except that in humans we do have this advantage of having language so that we can negotiate. But it's largely a matter, I think, of negotiation as opposed to somebody really seeing the deep truth and saying, oh yes, that is really right. It's a matter of, all right, he really hates it and she really likes it and I don't care that much. How are we going to come together on this? And it gets a fancy name in philosophy called reflective equilibrium, but I just calls it negotiation.
Anyone else?
So I guess the question is, what about what good is neuroscience in all of this? That's the heart of this matter. So let me give you an example where I think it might help. So social norms, I agree with you, don't exist kind of just to exist. They only exist to the extent that there's an individual benefit to adhering to them. So one set of problems that seems particularly problematic is things that fall in the area of tragedy of the commons. So, and kind of put it in more contemporary terms, we have a problem which most people would say is global warming. There's a shared incentive to solve this problem, but there's also a big individual disincentive to be the one solving it. This is very costly. And so one of the things that I think neuroscience is telling us about these types of problems is how the human brain kind of represents, in this case, outcomes that are very distant in time. And so I've had this conversation with many policymakers on the issue of global warming, one of whom has made a movie about it. And what I said was that you will never get people to change their behavior by the threat of future consequences. Has never worked. It doesn't help people quit smoking. It doesn't help people diet. It's not going to help them stop burning fossil fuels. And, you know, we know the reason for this in the brain is that a lot of the incentives that drive our behavior are governed by the dopamine system, systems that I talked about this morning, which tend to be very transient and very kind of bound in the present. Humans have some capacity, maybe a little better than other animals. You know, I wouldn't say terribly great about representing the future, but we're still not very good at, you know, making our actions based on something that's going to happen a year from now, 10 years, and certainly not 100 years from now. And so what it does is it starts to kind of paint constraints on our decision making that as individuals we have and we're not very good at. And once we're aware of that, then that says, well, okay, as individuals, if we are not very good at these types of decisions, we as individuals have to step out of it and create institutions that essentially protect us from our weaknesses. And that's, in my view, kind of what all the best institutions that are currently in the world today are. You know, many of the things that built this country put in place institutions, you know, that the founders had no idea were going to play out that way, but in the end seem to be pretty well adapted. So what the neuroscience is showing us are not how to do things yet, but what some of our limitations are.
Yeah, to piggyback on Greg's remarks and Patricia's, I think of moral theories as being solutions to a problem space, where the problem space is primarily social functional, right? What do I have to do as a member of a group so as to flourish? And so I think that notion of what moral theories are can tell us both why we see agreement and why we see disagreement. So it'll tell us why we see agreement because it turns out that the problem space that we confront as social creatures is the same across many environments. Right? So we have to learn to coordinate our actions so we can achieve group aims. We have to be able to protect ourselves against cheaters and defectors who would exploit that dynamic for personal gain and cause the group to collapse. And that is going to lead to a host of cognitive mechanisms being evolved to help us solve those problems. So that's why I think there's actually a lot of commonality in terms of solution sets for the moral problem space. But there will also be some differences, and there are a few reasons why there will be some differences too. First of all, not all environments are shared. Right? So it might be that the mechanisms we evolved to help us cope in one environment fall apart horribly in another. So perhaps some of the mechanisms we use to govern our behavior here in the conference room may be radically dysfunctional in wartime, for instance. Something I'm very concerned about as a military ethicist. So that'd be a homely example. And then secondly, it's also the case that some of the mechanisms we evolved to help us act in that problem space in the standard environment can be hyperactive. And that hyperactivity or hypoactivity might be normally distributed in the population. And then that would manifest itself as pathology, as difference, right? Which may itself be adaptive in the long run in the face of environmental shift, by the way, okay? And then I think the third thing that will cause some disagreement too is that there can be orthogonality in problem sets. So I know that's abstract, but what I mean by that is, you know, if the problem you're trying to solve is a social screw and it has both a slotted and a Phillips head interface, then either screwdriver will work to turn the screw. And so it goes for deontology and utility, right? The hidden seamy underbelly of applied ethics is that, look, most of the time these two theories agree about their solutions to problem space, and we get all wrapped around the axle as professional ethicists because we focus on the trolley problem and other unusual and in some cases non-ecologically valid examples of moral reasoning.
Can I address that for a second? And one of the things that I think becomes important to understand is that this neuroethics project doesn't necessarily disavow deontological ethics or utilitarian ethics or virtue ethics, but rather what it attempts to do is to create a structure and functional relationship of what those types of ethical behaviors and systems are doing for the agents who are involved. One of the conversations that Patricia Churchill and Paul Churchill and I had back, I guess it was back when we were in University of Texas Southwest, or that was in Texas last year, was that if you look at the way these things operate, you can think of them sort of like an ice cream cone, that in any particular situation, there are going to be a set of governing rules for that situation. Bill alluded to this very nicely. We behave one particular way in this conference room. If in fact you were on the tennis court, or if you were playing with your grandkids, or if you're at a gym, or even if you were perhaps at an auction, you'd behave very, very differently. So, we're sitting up here and Bill gives an answer and somebody in the back decides, well, he's going to bid on the next question. Well, that would be totally ridiculous in this situation. So what we find is that there are a set of operationalizable rules that say, if X, then Y. That's a deontic structure. If in this set of circumstances, these are the operational rules, duties, if you will, that said, if you buy the ticket, you take this ride. If you don't take this ride, there might be problems. Well, why would you then need to take that particular ride if you're in that set of circumstances? Because there may indeed be necessary outcomes, consequences, which is part of the calculus of any set of circumstances and situations, which is a set of circumstances, institutions, agents, intentions, actions, behaviors, and consequences. So we have to appreciate the consequences because that is a neural dynamic of learning. One could go literally from the synaptic all the way to the hypersocial for that one. But then let's not forget also that the things that are doing this are agentic. They're working as agents. So some form of an agentic ethic is certainly going to be valid and valuable in this particular set of circumstances. So we've gone from a very, very large opening of that cone in a variety of circumstances down to the filter and orthogonalities, as Bill has suggested, which then create some form of at least consequential manifestations for individuals within an ecology set of niches and groups that ultimately have to be parsed, decided upon, weighed, and then ultimately acted upon by virtue of intentionality by an individual. So we see that the project of neuroscience and neuroethics, when taken biopsychosocially, doesn't necessarily disavow one form of ethics or another, but tries to create a working concept of how individuals and groups may utilize each one of these different, if you will, rule sets and operational parameters in their individual and interactive behaviors. What might neuroscience be able to afford to that? I have no idea. I think one thing it'll be able to do is to help us look in, and perhaps on the other hand, what it'll help us to do is to recognize that some things are very effective and other things are very, very foolish. So it might add a little bit of pragmatism to the actual equation of how we look at these problems, not necessarily even giving answers.
I really appreciate this highly intellectual, at the same time practical value discussion. There is all kind of dogmatic statements made by people in power, like God came and talked to them and all that. And people like you should counter that in some way or form, and it should not go uncountered. Especially, this is important for the young people. They should be able to, they may not be able to attend conferences like this, but they should have a mechanism of learning through the Facebook and all the other web media. They should have a discussion group or something like that that will bring this to the outside world. We have come a long way, especially in addiction and sexual orientation. The neuroscience and the imaging and all have done dramatic improvement and has changed the mind of a lot of people. So I think this is very, very important. I come from Tamil Nadu, India, and there is a saying about 2,000 years ago, a book of reason. It says, no matter who says what, the truth should be found out. So that should be our motto, I think. Thank you.
I'd like my colleague John Shook to actually address that question for a number of different reasons. One is that he's written a very, very popular and I think very good book called The God Debates. There are certain individuals who have a very strong sense of spirituality that is not necessarily confined to a particular form of religion. There are other individuals who actually contextualize that. It may be very anthropologically and socially beneficial for them to do that in the sense of what religion does for them and for their group. There are other individuals who hear voices talking to them all the time, and we may not necessarily think them as crazy, we may call them to be shamans. So I think part of it is contextualizing that and what that means. But John's work on this, I think, is very important because it helps to ground the neuroscience project, at least in part, to its ethical dimension of what that might mean. John.
So there.
I can't actually take credit for doing any original research in the uses and applications of the social, behavioral, and cognitive sciences on religion, but I can tell you what is being said. I try to stay on top of it, and I work for an organization, the Center for Inquiry, that is very interested in the scientific examination of religion, and we've been at it a very long time from the leadership of Paul Kurtz. Science is going a long way towards understanding religious phenomenon among human beings. It is possible to use neuroscience to examine various sorts of religious phenomenon as reported at the individual and collective level, and this is interesting and important work. We need as much scientific information as possible about every corner of the breadth and width and value of human experience. That's not the controversial part. The controversial part is the question to which that scientific information is going to have bearing on what religious people care about more, namely, is there a God, and if so, is he talking to me, right? I mean, that's what they would love to know. So there, for example, is a growing field called neurotheology. I don't know how fast or how far it'll get, but there are researchers interested in trying to understand the cognitive underpinnings of how people arrive at various sorts of religious convictions, beliefs, emotions, you know, the sort of spiritual dimension, and then translate that into action. And again, that looks to be, much of it, very interesting and valuable work. We need as much information as possible about human beings and all of their manifestations and modes. There are some people enthusiastically doing neurotheology with other religious agendas, and I think this is where your curiosity may be more piqued. And so there does have to be scientific scrutiny on claims that, in fact, go beyond the actual natural evidence about what human beings happen to be doing. Claims, for example, that the religious brain is more natural than the non-religious brain. These claims are proliferating, some by neurotheologians, but many just by lay people with vested interests trying to take advantage of neuro-nonsense and so forth. So the arguments go back and forth. I think we have to watch the developments of those arguments very carefully and make sure that whether you are happen to be religious or you happen to be skeptical, neither camp should be allowed to illegitimately use the available evidence beyond its actual warrant. Everybody needs to be cautious about that.
One moment.
A different question. One, though, dealing with neurological processes. Recently I heard that dementia is particularly prevalent among aging people. Today, in this country alone, the cost to society is about $280 billion per year. By 2050, it may well reach $1 trillion per year. Given budgetary austerity, as it's now called, what are some of the neuroethical implications of a neurological disease like Alzheimer's or other dementia? And how does this compare to, for example, the phenomena that we saw in the 1960s where the psychiatric patients in state mental hospitals were released by the tens of thousands at once with the advent of certain medications?
I'll try to say something really quickly about this. I'm so glad you raised that because I think in the field of neuroethics, there's been a tendency, and I guess some of my colleagues have raised this as criticism of the field, there's been a tendency to focus on, as they might say, small beer issues. Issues having to do with cognitive enhancement using things like Ritalin and modafinil and so forth. But as you say, the end-of-life issues are huge, and they're not being addressed very often or very thoroughly. The other huge issue, which so far as I can tell, neuroethicists have not really plunged into, have to do with the drug laws, where again, the human cost is absolutely staggering. The cost to the budget is absolutely staggering, whereas something like cognitive enhancement, I mean, it's not even on the radar. And there could really be an important beginning of discussing end-of-life issues in a sensible, straightforward, sensitive way, where people are not just doing this. There is an interesting question about end-of-life issues. Let's talk about it. But where they would actually take a stand, defend it, and make a case. And then if somebody else wants to, present a different issue, that's well and good. But I'd love to see the applied neuroethicists not just say really important things are going to happen really soon from neuroscience, but if they would actually grab a hold of some of these issues and run with the ball.
Yeah, I have a comment on it. Let me contrast that with an issue that's very similar at the other end of the age spectrum. So this is not so much a neuroethics question, it's a neurolaw question, which is where a lot of this stuff is actually playing out. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, over the last several years, the Supreme Court has been essentially revisiting issues of responsibility in minors for crimes, particularly violent crimes. And through a series of decisions, they basically said you cannot execute mentally handicapped individuals who have committed crimes, and then they, I think a year or two ago, extended that to minors who commit murders. You can imprison them for life, you can't execute them, and then last year, they got rid of imprisonment for life for non-murder crimes. What's interesting about that debate, and there's actually a very kind of large developmental psychology lobby that has been lobbying the Supreme Court for years on this issue. And I would argue a lot of the reasoning is not based in science at this point in time. What's interesting is that they've been using the idea of the adolescent brain, and I put that in air quotes because I don't think it's a thing, to argue, essentially in Friends of the Court briefs, that the adolescent brain is not fully developed and therefore adolescents should not be held to the same standard of responsibility as adults. None of this is new. What is new is in the last decision, this actually did make it into the Supreme Court's decisions, where they actually did cite neuroscience evidence for the first time that I'm aware of, which actually sets, in my view, a very dangerous precedent in taking neuroscience, into a realm that it has never been before. The reason this has something to do with issues late in life is I would argue that the changes in the brain late in life far out-swamp changes during adolescence. You can take an MRI of someone in their 80s and you can easily see that there just is not as much gray matter there than when they were younger. You cannot see that in an adolescent. So the idea of an adolescent brain is a very nebulous concept, but the idea of an old brain, that is very concrete. And so, when neuroscience starts entering the judiciary, it's unknown kind of what the consequences of this are. And so I wrote an op-ed piece arguing at the time, this was when the Madoff thing was going on, that based on his age alone, he should not have gotten that sentence, based on the fact that his brain had obviously deteriorated, if you extend that logic. So.
And I want to pass it to Eric, but I want to address that for a moment, because this whole issue of making that jump from this neuroscience, neuroethics to neurolaw, then speaks back to your point, sir, and then directly to Patricia's point about, well, let's do something with this. And I agree, let's do something with this. Part of the issue with making these jumps to neurolaw is that there are two sets of criteria very often that are then utilized when approaching how we utilize neuroscience or how we engage neuroscience or neurotechnology in a court of law. One is known as a Frye standard, and a Frye standard talks about relevance. And the other, somewhat more stringent standard, is referred to as a Daubert standard, which talks about reliability, not only of the data but of the technique to then create a viable population referent. It's what Eric referred to earlier as a very casuistic approach to looking at paradigmatic data and how those paradigmatic data are referential to this particular case and its reliability. We use both of those standards often in U.S. courts of law, and the problem with both of those is they are determined by the judiciary. They look at a set of experts or expert data and say, yes, this is relevant, and most of it tends to be relevant. They put it into a grab bag and say it's neurological. And they say, well, is it actually reliable? And this then gets into the issue of looking at the technology and science assessment. However, we're also getting into a very interesting area, and this is going back to your question why I want to bring it to you. The idea of prediction and neuroethics and neurolaw is one of those things that we're really flirting with neuroscience and neurotechnology. Not only what I can actually see and define, but what can I see and define now that has some predictive element for the future that then compels or mitigates my action. You asked about the whole senile dementia, Alzheimer's type, and other forms of dementia that may be leverageable, usable, influential within the Neuroethics Committee. The Robert Bosch Foundation in Germany, out of Heidelberg, is directly approaching this, neuroscientifically, anthropologically, and now neuroethically. Their whole idea is, there is an issue here. It deals with genetic and phenotypic diagnosis, and do we intervene or do we not intervene? Do we create some form of use of neuroscience and neurotechnology to generate a form of what we call commutative justice that said these individuals may be in higher need based upon the fact that we're literally losing their intellect and they're going to be a valuable contribution to society, and we could in fact enable these individuals to then be more productive into their golden years, and as such create a more generationally focused research and practical program. But then the issue becomes who gets this stuff? Everybody? Some people. Those who can afford it? Is it a form of cosmetic neuroscience and neurology? What standard do we use upon which to predicate the decision in one way or the other? And then it goes one step further. What if we could actually eliminate that? And if we eliminate that, we then get a form of what's called euneuromics. And euneuromics is one step away from eugenics. And we rally against that, particularly my colleagues in Europe, particularly my colleagues in Germany rally against that word. But what tends to happen is, as Patricia said, we have to make a strong stance that is indeed directional. This is something we want to do, and we're going to recognize the pros and cons, benefits, burdens, and potential risks, and accept the social responsibility because we view this as a viable, sanctioned good. At that point, we then have to look at what ethical information might inform certain laws and how extant or perhaps new standards within the law might need to be developed or used so as to then create a much more valid palette of distributable justice rather than just commutative justice. And that's where this is really going. Some of the work, of course, of Carter Snead, Henry Greeley in this country, and also look to the group out of the University of Bonn, who's doing some wonderful work with neuroscience and neurotechnology and the law. A very, very good group. Let me hand the mic over to Eric because I know he's also done some work with some of the neurogenetics that speak to this question as well. Please.
So very briefly, I think you're very right to point out the potential epidemic of Alzheimer's disease and to highlight both the potential, burden, health burden on our economy, societies, families that this represents, as well as the same time as our need to develop ethical responses and to sort out what we're going to do with this situation. And it seems like many countries are slowly acknowledging this problem. For example, France has developed an national Alzheimer's plan, and a couple of Canadian provinces are starting to think about how we're going to react or respond collectively. Because as you're describing it, this is not a problem touching only individuals, it's touching families and societies, and raises really fundamental questions about our ethical and consistent approaches to different kinds of disorders, cancer versus neurological and psychiatric disorders on the other hand, and are we consistent in our way of supporting healthcare and research in these areas or not? By saying that, I think, it'd be nice to have a magic bullet. It'd be nice if the neuroethicists could, deliver easy solutions. I think, some are doing some headway. For example, Joe Finns at Cornell has been doing some work highlighting, for example, what he describes as the neuronal diaspora of highly severe brain injured patients and how we are sometimes neglecting them systematically. So some people are highlighting the problem, but I think we'll need to do more work in this area, and likely what I see as a challenge is perhaps what was alluded to is this potential lack of flexibility in our ethical approaches and thinking, which perhaps can be captured under the banner of religious thinking, but it could be also captured under the quest for certainty, which could be religious and non-religious, I think. But these kinds of problems will call for an ability, I think, collectively to deliberate. Now, how useful neuroscience will be in informing that process, I'm not sure. I would think that, having a deeper understanding of these situations will be critical. At the same time, I don't think it's only a matter of knowledge, it's a matter of knowledge of how to use knowledge and wisdom. And that to me calls for an appreciation of the fact that our responses, our collective responses will need to be opened up to revision of our ethical approaches, and also open enough to cues about what's going wrong, because we're talking about a patient population that can easily be shelved, basically, to describe things very negatively, and we forget about them. So what are going to be our ethical cues to realize that there is an ethical problem that we need to respond? So I'm concerned not only about the ability or inability of academic ethics to furnish that response, but first of all, we'll need to recognize that there is a problem, and that this is a problem that calls for some kind of collective approach.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit curmudgeonly now, so uncharacteristically. A huge amount of the Medicare budget is spent on people who are in nursing homes, who have no bowel and bladder control, who essentially have no cognitive function, and at the same time, it appears to be the case that there are many schools in the inner city that are very run down and children who are not getting educated. So I don't think we need to discuss whether there is a problem. What I would like to see is something that comes out of neuroethics that doesn't just say, we need to get together and talk about this problem because it's very complex and raises many issues. I would like to see them move forward on this, and there are many ways of doing it. I mean, one thing would be to discuss a proposal that allows for end of life in something like the way they do in Oregon. So I'm much less concerned with my being put on a shelf somewhere than I am, and hence not getting what you might call full care, than the fact that I'm not allowed, if I should be diagnosed as very demented, to do anything about it. I don't need right now to talk about that. I need you guys to make a proposal. And what I see happening in neuroethics, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it may be that the people that you're talking about are not just saying, here's a really interesting problem and we need to talk about it. What I see in neuroethics is a willingness to say how complex the problem is and how difficult it is, and we should talk about it, but nothing is actually proposed. There's no moving forward on the issue. And there is on these teeny-weeny little, what I'm calling small beer issues. But why aren't you guys addressing the big issues? We know what they are. And we know what the data are, we know what the costs are. Why don't you guys talk about these things?
I think, I feel just a bit on the spot. No, I think to be fair, I think you're right to point out that we need to think about, I think not only neuroethics, but bioethics generally, why are we doing the kind of work we're doing, and why are we focusing on certain questions to the detriment of others? So that's one thing, and I think so that's one question, I think. Second, I think the field there are many different people involved in neuroethics, and some have more interest for clinical ethics issues, We've certainly done a bit of work in this area. There's much, much more work to be done. I think what you call for, neuroethicists proposing, I'm in favor of, but when you're talking about sorting out systems of care for, like, let's say, Alzheimer's patient, for example, other situations in which my team is involved is cerebral palsy, so the very young children with motor and language disability, and how we're treating them, and lack of resources there. So.
Making it more complex. All I'm asking is that you guys take a stand on something, and then other people may push back, and we can negotiate and so forth. But don't tell me what the problem is. I know what the problem is. Take a stand on it. Give me reasons for and against, and let's see if it's something that can be done.
Yeah, I see your point, although I understand your point, but I mean, the bioethicist is not, is not a new expert that will tell people how to think. I think it makes.
You guys aren't the expert. Who the heck is?
No, but I mean,
That is not a good answer, and it's not a good answer.
Let's take a question from across
I
the
see
room
that
over
the
here, and then we'll
panel-
come back over here. Sir?
The panel is very active here, but I had a question, a follow-up on John's talk, and I was wondering what other panelists might think of the dilemmas that he raised and whether it will change the way you might pursue your profession, or you think those are issues that you have something to ask John about.
I gave a paper that was skeptical, and then I played the cynic here. But, I wish I could have given the other paper that I co-wrote with Jim that's in the pipeline for publication, because that's the optimistic one. I think that, as a matter of fact, neuroethics can lead towards a humanistic cosmopolitanism that is capable of guiding this planet towards the future. It's going to be messy, but you got to deal with all the skepticism. So in many ways, mine was sort of a ground clearing to give some skepticism its due, and then we'll run roughshod over it. But that would be a different conference. So I'm not actually a cynic about this. I'm actually very hopeful. The problem is, of course, twofold. Neuroethicists, like many scientists, are interested in how to make the good life better, not the other 6 billion that are rotting to death to early graves on this planet. We know how the system works, right? And the other major problem is a lot of people, to the extent that they become interested in the normative side of bioethics or neuroethics, they're trying to prevent the next crazy, loony thing that's going to get forced down our throats that might make our lives even worse, because these technologies have evil applications as well as good. And I applaud that effort. So, right, but our forces are scattered and divided, and there's many simultaneous motivations.
Okay, I'll respond. The honest opinion is I've yet to meet an ethicist who's not wagging their finger at me saying, don't do that. And that's a big problem. It's not that we kind of bumble along blindly doing experiments and just kind of throwing people in scanners willy-nilly reading their minds. It's not how it is at all, but that's often the perception of what we do. And in fact, sometimes we get lucky and discover something really cool and interesting and probably has absolutely no practical application, but, it tells us something about who we are and how the universe works, and that's valuable in and of itself. But the fact is that there are a dozen, if not more, regulatory agencies, breathing down my neck every day, when I put someone in a scanner, and it's actually quite difficult to do things. So, I'm still waiting for someone who calls themselves a bioethicist to say, to come to me and say, we have this really interesting problem. Could we use neuroscience to solve it instead of, don't do that?
There are two sides to the field, right? And I have my neuroscientist hat on now, not my neuroethicist hat on. And of course, some of you know me. I was what some people consider to be like the most heinous form of neuroscience. I was a pain researcher. God. And so the issue there is, oh my God, what are you doing? You're inflicting pain. Well, wait, yeah, but it's for the opposite effect. We're trying to do good here, and there is that balance of benefit and burden that goes along with that. And I think one of the things that you raised a really good point. Part of the mission here is to say, how do we utilize neuroscience to engage some of these issues about the way moral cognitions and actions are then engaged, obtained, enacted. And there is that movement. I mean, a lot of your work is actually doing that movement. You know, Glimcher's work, certainly there's the group in Tübingen and the group in Munich. And so there is a very strong trend to go in that direction. Some of the work of George Cush, for those of you who may or may not know the ethicist George Cush, I think what George has to say is something very, very important. He looks at ethics a little bit differently, not necessarily as a proscriptive medium, and John and I take the same approach, particularly with neuroethics, but rather to define what the terrain is, inclusive of some of the ethical questions, and say, all right, how do we navigate the science that we're already doing? The pendulum swing is that the science is already moving. That's the momentum. What the ethics is there to do is to define what that trajectory in space looks like and help to guide that own way forward that mistakes are not being made. Not necessarily to be prescriptive against the science, and then also to engage the science to try to utilize a better form of ethics. But this is a difficult dance. What Patricia is recommending, I think, is really that interface between the science, the ethics, and the policy. Far too long, what tends to happen, and I've seen this often, is that the philosophy folks, I play with them all the time, these are important questions. Let's argue about them. The policy people sort of chase each other around on a tail and say, well, he said, she said, he said, she said, we can't come to any consensus. But I think one of the things that's going to really be important from the neuroethical field, and this is what John brought up, and in the sense of optimism, is to accept Pat's challenge, to work with what Greg puts forth, to identify these variables that Bill was talking about, and to utilize neuroethics the way Eric depicted it, as both descriptive and, in some cases, causal, effective. And that's to say, we've looked at these data and we need to do this. Let's do this. And in fact, you know, one of the things that we're looking to do here, I mean, you're sitting at the Potomac Institute, I'll toot the horn a little bit, is if we're not able to then actively inform something that is going to create an articulation, we have to drop that project. It's not just a bunch of mental onanism and going, what's the nature of the problem? It's what are you going to do about that problem? Identify the problem and then do something, take a stance. You're going to get pushed back on. And so that's interesting, because I think what it does is it compels action. In some of my talks, I refer to a dose of Deweyism and very strong Arendtian action. Hannah Arendt, the principal scholar who studied with Karl Jaspers, referred to different ways that people can do things. They can put their head down and sort of slave away. She also looked at technology in a particular way, reflective of Dewey. And then she also said that humans can be creative and ingenious and think about what it is they're doing. But they just shouldn't think, because thought without action is worse than sometimes no thought at all. And I think the challenge is the action step.
I think we have two really wonderful examples of how ethicists can proceed here. And one, of course, is what happened in, I guess it was the early 60s at Asilomar, when molecular biologists addressed the possible question of misuses of molecular biology and set up regulations, discussed them, banded them back and forth, put them into place, and it actually worked extremely well. The other model was not actually from America, but was from Britain. So when stem cells were early on recognized to be very powerful tools, a committee was set up by Mary Warnock, who happened to be a philosopher, but it involved mostly scientists, and they toured around the country and they listened to all kinds of people, and then they put together a set of proposals that involve various kinds of regulations to make this work. They tried it out all over the country. They made some modifications, and it went through Parliament. It became law. So what they didn't have was this tremendous division that we saw, where people went bananas over the very idea of stem cell research. And that was partly because people could look at the regulations and see what they were, and besides, they had already contributed to it. So what I'm proposing, in a way, is that those people who say they are ethicists should, for these really big problems like the drug laws and like end-of-life issues, where some of us would like to have physician-assisted suicide or whatever you want to call it, set up a regulatory body that does something similar to Mary Warnock's thing. And don't just tell us that this is a complex problem. Let's actually go about having some regulations in place that might work.
This is for Dr. Burns. I was very impressed with what you said recently about the fact that dopamine and various other neurochemicals and processes make us think shortly on a short term rather than the long term. I've had some experience on the Hill as an advocate for action on global warming to address the climate change problem. And that's just one of many examples, which you apparently know something about, where this is a very serious problem because due to economic interests and for other reasons, essentially nothing is being done now. And the science is overwhelmingly supportive of the fact that the problem is real. What you said suggests to me a possible practical application, pragmatic application of neuroscience as applied to neuroethics in what society should do. I can say the National Academy is becoming increasingly frustrated with the amount of actual lying that is taking place in lobbying the government to do nothing to address global warming. It seems to me if we could put more emphasis on legal action to recognize lying and take action against it on questions like this, we might be able to accelerate process a little bit. And this would be a direct application of something you have done research on to a very serious problem.
Yes, I'm going this way. She's coming around the other way. I'm not going to let this go.
There was a hint of this problem before when one of the speakers, I forget who, expressed concern about getting a judgment based on neuroscience into a court case. Now, first of all, folks, that's a sign of success. It was important enough that it'll be in a court case. Now, that raises a lot of problems, but there's a lesson here. And the lesson is politics. What you need is a political move, not a scientific move, not an ethical move, not a policy move. And politics is still different. And it's the thing that trumps all the rest, usually. And I think in a country that's supposed to be, whose actions are supposed to be based on the will of the people, not a bad way to start. So I think what I recommend to the group here is, suppose you take on these 2 or 3 very practical problems, Alzheimer's, end of life, which I'm interested in for obvious reasons. I see it coming. And a few others, and say, now what if anything this group feels like doing that is action-oriented? And the moment you do that, your feet are in the political scene. You cannot avoid it. And there will be at least 2 of maybe 15 different positions available to you. But you'll have to declare. And you may not want to do that. Scholars often balk at that moment, say, sure, but not me, you know. And well, you have to decide.
You're much better speaker.
I mean, yeah, there's a sense in which it is a political thing because it pertains to policy and ultimately perhaps to legislation. But there are a lot of people who are getting paid under the description, the job description, applied ethics or ethicist. And I'm not quite sure that I want to advise them on how they can connect to these major issues, but I think it's an ethical obligation for them to do so and to not just sit back and delineate complexities. But if they want to be applied ethicists, they really need to move forward on it.
Yeah, a quick comment that's related to both of your questions. I am conflicted on the issue of neuroethics because I have a foot in both camps as an ethicist and as a cognitive neuroscientist. So on the pure ethicist side, as an academic hobby horse, I want to ride the neuroscience towards a vindication of Aristotelian psychology. Right? I think there's a fair amount of evidence in favor of that proposition that we could talk about later. But having said that, on the more practical side and the cognitive neuroscience side, I think I'm with John Dewey that the type of cultural change that we're looking for that might help us address issues like end-of-life care or lack of education for underserved populations, I don't think neuroethicists in either the theoretical or the applied sense are going to have a result that on any particular day is going to help us shift a culture that addresses either of those questions, especially not in a way that's politically tenable, as you point out, Charles. So what I hold out hope there, rather, is that we can continue to drive home points that will slowly percolate their way into our culture via the language we use, the concepts that we articulate, the way we frame problems, so that 20 or 30 years later we might discover we've reached a space where politically we can finally reach a resolution to a problematic situation. So that's a different vision, if you will, about what neuroethics would play. Now, having said that, though, also on the cognitive neuroscience side, I think there are areas where there's low-hanging fruit. And the best way to structure those by my lights is to use Jim Rest's model of moral behavior. And he identifies 4 factors that are salient. He doesn't focus on the neuroscience. This is more from the psychological perspective. Namely, that any given moral behavior, you have questions about moral sensitivity, about moral judgment, about moral motivation, and about moral skill. And I think that in many circumstances, when we do have political agreement that something that needs to be done, that neuroethicists can give us lots of interesting advice about how we massage the ecosystems we live in so we make a difference on these 4 dimensions, right? So moral sensitivity is in part related to these theory of mind mechanisms that several of us discussed this morning, where there are very interesting linguistic backdoors that might cue theory of mind mechanisms in a way that would be more likely to generate perspective taking, right? A difference in language can make a difference in whether or not I'm aware of the suffering of another. Moral motivation and moral judgment, those are differentially activated by things such as stress that we often don't foreground when we talk about making a bad judgment. So I used to teach, for example, at the Air Force Academy, where we have an honor code, and we're working with a highly hand-picked student population where nonetheless people do cheat and they do make mistakes. And on the one hand, we have the tendency to say there's something wrong with you, you're broken, right? And the honor code has helped us identify how you're broken as a human being. But it turns out that if you unpack that story more fully, there are lots of other causal factors, if you will, that load on bad decision making, including things like lack of sleep and poor planning. So if you want to produce an ecosystem where people are less likely to cheat or to lie to each other, maybe you should address these factors of sleep and planning. And there are lots of practical tools you can do that help you do that. And it's the neuroscience that sits behind that that might give us a quantitative assay for the efficacy of some of these interventions. So it would go for all 4 factors. There, I think there actually is lots of low-hanging fruit. And if you want to hear more about that, in 2 weeks there's a conference at New York University on this topic where the first day and a half is all on the theoretical neuroethics side, and the second day and a half is about whether or not character development institutions and other forms of organization that we use to do things like develop character can be changed in light of the neuroethics findings. Yes, sir.
But most of the focus here has been on how the herd stabilizes itself. And I'm thinking about the outliers, and this just almost in our generation, maybe since Gandhi and the civil rights movement, you got 2 big blocks of young people, one using jihadi-type violence and the other using Occupy-type nonviolence. And it would be fascinating with groups like that to be able to study, to look at both the neuro causes and the neuro effects of being outliers in a society that's not very stable.
Yes, it would be, but it's not going to happen. So kind of back to my other point, that it's not easy to get people to go in the machinery necessary to study their brains, and in many of the cultures that you mentioned, that is just not going to happen. Bill, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just pile on and say it's a nice question, and I agree with Greg's answer. But I would say still that there are some low-hanging fruit, and these low-hanging fruit also point out how neuroethics can be a self-corrective enterprise. Take, for instance, the relationship between the ability to catalyze serotonin in the brain and violent behavior. Right, so there were several findings about MAOA mutants, monoamine oxidase A mutants. MAOA mutants are folks who on the tail end of the Y chromosome lack the set of genes that code for the proteins that ultimately help you catalyze serotonin. And so as a result, they had radical serotonin imbalances that some people suspected drove them towards violent behavior. And there was some population level evidence for that if you looked at the prison population in California, where there were a higher percentage of MAOA mutants among males, right? This is on the tail end of the Y chromosome, so men are more likely, far more likely to be MAOA mutants. And so that is an initial application, if you will, of neuroethics to, maybe we have a profiling issue here, maybe there could be some kind of intervention to correct this. That was almost too quick, though, right? Because that science later came under fire for methodological reasons, and also because it neglected epigenetic factors that people like John Cacioppo at Chicago study. And it turns out that there are critical breakpoints in ontogeny as a child where there are very interesting relationships between mechanisms of methylation that affect the expression of this gene and the way you're treated by your parents that suddenly cloud the causal story in ways that also themselves have institutional design upshot. Yeah.
One quick follow-up comment, because Bill just said something that reminded me of this. So my colleague Paul Volpe has written extensively on this issue, and the question kind of legally is that the area of functional MRI and brain imaging in particular is somewhat in limbo right now. And he has written about the concern that a court could compel someone to go and get an fMRI. And there's an issue of whether that violates Fifth Amendment protections, because it's somewhat in this space between, is it a medical test or is it reading your thoughts, in which case you're forcing a testimony against it yourself. So it is actually a relevant question on kind of how you can access it, and I do see that as an ethical question. So.
Other question?
After all of these findings down the road, maybe 5 years, 10 years, there is any connection perhaps between the findings and the pharmaceutical companies where they can make some medicine or some chemicals that will alter some of these behaviors that they are not perhaps beneficial to humankind?
Let me take that first. The answer is yes. The second answer is we already do. And then the third point is some of those drugs are pretty dirty also. I mean, part of the whole, what I would call pharmaceutical agenda, is also to begin to develop more specific agents to be able to then target what we now understand is a much more complex set of mechanisms than we knew 2 years ago, 5 years ago, et cetera. I sort of came into the field as a neuropharmacologist, and I'm here to tell you, the pharmacology we learned was pretty basic, and that's still operational to a very large extent. But the level of complexity that my students are now learning in neuropharmacology, for example, like Rachel Wertzman, and so, out of the ballpark, truly. Because we understand more about what's going on a variety of different levels and mechanisms within that particular substrate, which is the cell and its various domains. Each one of those, as I had mentioned earlier in my lecture, is both accessible and then ultimately becomes a putative or a viable target to be accessed. The question here then is not, well, can this be done? The technology will eventually yield the capability to do this. This too is a tool. What are we going to do with that? That then becomes sort of the question that is then thrown back into both neuroscience and neuroethics, and then ultimately is very strongly utilized, employed, all the way up from law, policy, and of course politics. And you may or may not be aware of something known as the National Neurotechnology Initiative that was proposed a number of years ago. That fell by the wayside. It was eclipsed by the healthcare plan. But in some ways it's being revivified for this exact reason. We know more about neuroscience. If you may have read the OSTP report that came out at the beginning of March, it viewed neuroscience as a game changer with regard to being able to push the frontiers of what we're able to do in healthcare, public life, and a variety of other domains. And we also see about $150 billion of tentative market share that is going to be obtainable through the use of neuroscience and neurotechnology. There's big business here. This gets back to Charles's point. There has to be an equally strong set of not only neuroethical ideals, but these then have to be incorporated into a body politic that's able to say, this is what we're going to do with that. And we have to be very, very careful about that. And I could sort of then put on the pin and say, we at the Potomac Institute, but that's what we do. The idea here is, how do you take that science and technology, recognize what it is, see the ethical, legal, and social issues, and then in some way create a palette of information to inform policy and politics. Not always easy, but important to do, because that pendulum swing will happen. Not might happen, will happen. And that's critical. Yes, ma'am.
Do you want to know how you handle the media and the newspaper publishing your results and trying to take care of the penal system, like in India, subjecting one person and giving verdict for murder based on neuroscience? And how do you handle those kind of issues?
So I don't myself publish neuroscience data. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I get involved in the media to discuss ethical problems in which I'm involved as a researcher, and I can provide some insights. I think I basically try to apply similar, thinking that other scientists or researchers would, which is to talk about things I know something about and not get engaged in something I don't know something about, which is sometimes, for bioethics, I think is sometimes a problem. And make sure that you have, as much as you can, built-in mechanisms to review what you said to the journalist, try to clarify goals before doing the interview and so forth. So I think that's very practical, very reasonable. But I think when you get engaged in the media as a bioethicist, you have to think about the impact of what you're going to be saying, and if you feel comfortable in holding an opinion about what you're saying and have a knowledge base, or in my case, I need to be doing research on the topic to speak about it. Otherwise, I think I pass the buck to colleagues who are more knowledgeable.
I'll just say one thing, and I think the media is a dinosaur anyway, and it's going to be a moot point in 10 years.
Me. One thing I just not related to neuroethics, but probably, once this ultrasound of the uterus and the infant was published, and then people abused all over, a lot of infanticide happened. A lot of female children fetuses were sacrificed. So it's very possible it can become viral, like, where they want to use the system.
Let me reground it back to things that exist above the uterus, if we could. Keep it sort of above the tentorium. I'll charge you all with doing this. After you leave here, and you have your wine and cheese, and you're like really jazzed about all this, stop down to a newsstand, one of the better newsstands here in DC or in Arlington, and start to flip through magazines, and I guarantee you will see a neuro image in there, you'll see the word neuro, you'll see some description of something that relates to brain science, describing X, Y, or Z. Love, hate, sex, culture, something, and there'll usually be some pretty picture with like neurons that are color-coded for easy ID that light up like a pretty picture. There is a reciprocal responsibility. I don't necessarily share Greg's idea that the media will be dead. I think that what happens is we're seeing new forms of media. And I know even for what we do, there's a lot of that media that is self-generated. We tweet. I didn't know what tweet was until a year ago. We tweet. We have blogs, etc. There's a reciprocal responsibility. But I think this is one of the things that Eric also brought up, and I know he had done some work a couple of years ago with Judy and with Don DeRousseau, that looks at the fact, scientists are interesting. We think that either we are very important, or what we do is, it's just one little cog in this huge wheel. So when somebody takes a microphone, puts it in your face, you say what you know. That then can become a soundbite. And that can be used in a variety of ways, not malevolently, but to make certain points. We work all the time with media here. We have a media and outreach director, and what's very, very important to recognize is you may spend literally 40, 50 minutes talking to a reporter for less than a sentence, because they want that. It makes a statement. There's going to be an increased responsibility that comes on the part of the scientist and the bioethicist to be able to control that flow of information because the ivory tower of academia has been cracked, and the rigor of that peer-reviewed process by which you're guilty before you're even proven innocent and have to then get the paper published and reviewed, etc., that is no longer. Now these results can literally spill out of the laboratory, out of the FMR, out of our think tank, literally into the public. And as a consequence, there's a very, very different engagement of social media and other forms of media that are probably changing that landscape. And I think I'm a big fan of the media, because I think what the media can do is the media can really help to preserve the integrity of neuroscience, neuroethics, etc. But I think what ends up happening is, like so many other things, when you actually open that box, you then have the responsibility of what comes out of it. And we've opened that social media box, and we've opened that box of now spilling out into the information superhighway, and it becomes important to recognize there's a whole new set of contingencies.
So some of you have kind of tangentially answered this question already, but where do you feel the end game of neuroethics should be? Should it be with gaining understanding and human insight? Should it be with setting out a set of principles that govern or help to inform things? Should it be with proposing policy? And the more specific version of the question is it the responsibility of neuroethicists to propose and defend policy, or is their responsibility more on the side of engaging the policy community and trying to motivate them, or do they have no bearing in the policy community whatsoever?
Tell you what I'm going to do. You were not a plant. We didn't pay you to ask that question, but it's a wonderful terminus question. Because what it really does is it sort of works like a commencement. It says, how do we go forward? You know, I've used this phrase as sort of coming of age and facing the future. Well, what are we going to do with it? And I think that's a really good way to put a bow on this. I know Dr. Racine has to jet out of here pretty quickly and go catch a plane, and so what I'm going to do is let him answer first, quickly, sort of going fast, go hit hard and get out, and then he has to leave, and I want to make sure he gets a big round of applause before he goes and thank him for the time. And then I want to just pass the mic down. So we'll start with Eric, and then it'll come back to me because I have a little bit of a vision on this too. Eric, it's all yours.
So, you know, I think we have to recognize that there are different visions of the field. Personally, I'm more involved in trying to develop responses in healthcare delivery and healthcare services. Others are more involved in science and technology, ethics. So, and others are more into the realm of theoretical, neuroethics or neuroscience of ethics. All of that is very interesting. My focus is more pragmatic. I'm interested in developing collaborations with clinicians to respond and develop approaches to respond to challenges in healthcare. So in a nutshell, I think, is that short enough?
That's right.
Okay,
Great.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks. Dr. Eric Racine, please. Thank you. We're here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Safe travels back. Thank you. Great.
Okay, so yes, the end game, I mean, I think it's premature to define what the end game is. What I think is reasonable is to use neuroscience to define and learn more about what the constraints our brain place on decision making, and I think that is very achievable and it is being done. The game after that is what do we use that knowledge for? In my vision, it's coming back to the global warming problem. Okay, so we have very specific constraints on our decision-making systems that are not well evolved for decisions that span centuries. It's in that space that we then have to kind of step outside of our individual brains and make institutions that counteract these tendencies for bad decisions, either individually but mostly collectively. So to me, that's the end game.
Yeah, I don't know really what the end game is either because neuroscience is in such early days. But my own interest, of course, is really in the science itself. and in the nature of decision making and how the emotions and the non-emotional cognitive stuff are integrated. There are lots and lots and lots of people in philosophy departments who call themselves ethicists, and as I said earlier, I think some of them should be involved in policy issues. But they tend not to be. It tends to be left to the political scientists who don't talk to the philosophers either.
I'm deeply concerned about a neuroethical dystopia lying down at the end of it. Suppose we discovered all of the mechanisms that are involved in human social cognition and moral cognition. Suppose we had that, the complete equivalent of the genome of how we do it. Turns out, and I don't think anybody will be surprised, different sorts of people, depending on their genetics and their socialization and their enculturalization and all the stuff that's going on in their lives, do morality in lots of different ways. We'll be looking at a large area of overlap having to do with our evolutionary history, and we'll have a large amount of pluralism. Not just the familiar moral and cultural pluralism, but we'll have brain pluralism. The overwhelming temptation at that point will be to say, well, my moral brain is just as natural and appears to function by my lights as well as your brain, and now we have full stop, nothing you can do about it, stuck in concrete ethical pluralism, where everybody can claim that they have just as natural a right to their ethical platitudes and their ethical paradigm as anybody else. And you will find an entrenched paradigm relativism, more entrenched than your worst nightmare of cultural relativism now, backed by science. It might not happen, but it could happen. The large overlap that we share might be matched by a naturalistic rigidity. This has happened before. We know how to do this, okay? And we tend to reuse things that have been done for good as well as evil in the past. So then the question becomes, can neuroethicists be part of avoiding that neuroethical dystopia where we start to categorize ourselves by our brains, right? How can we avoid this? You have this kind of brain, well I have that kind of brain, and you have that kind of brain, and sort of these are conversation stoppers in the way that religion can be a conversation stopper sometimes. So then the question becomes, how do we avoid that? It would be lovely to have a universal humanistic consensus on core platitudes at least, if not genuinely objective principles. I think we might get there, but along the way there's going to be a lot of people deeply worried about various sorts of neuroethical dystopias that could emerge, all backed by all sorts of pharmaceuticals to reinforce it. Utilitarian brains want to be more utilitarian. There's going to be a pharmaceutical array of ways of becoming more utilitarian. The deontologists will say, no thanks, we want to become more deontological brains. And they'll be able to find the levers to do that. It's a possible scenario, not highly likely, right? But it's possible. I'm not in favor of it, but it's not obvious to me how we will avoid it just by more neuroscience alone.
I could leave you with that. One of the things I want you to remember, I think, is that every dystopian vision may in fact have started out as a utopian ideal. And I think the real issue here is how do we balance our dystopian anxieties with our utopian expectations and do so in a way that tries to really walk that center line of what the reality is, of what we can do, can't do, and what we should do with what we've got. There's a real reason for the science, because I think the science can teach us those things. We try to discuss this from the position we call in-step, integrative science, technology, ethics, policy, and politics. Charles brought up a good point. He's really not my straight man. He really did bring up a good point. It goes nowhere unless it's both bottom-up and top-down. So I think that the days where there's going to be silos of individuals who are sort of working in their little cloister, in many ways are gone. It's going to create a larger discourse. I think that discourse will then literally stimulate something more of a sense of openness to a cosmopolitanism, because we'll learn more about commonalities, anthropological variants, and anthropological similarities. John is right in a very real sense. Look around the room. Phenotypically, we don't look identical. We're not a bunch of clones. How do we appreciate what we have in common may be parts of our difference? And what does a brain have to do with that? And how do we come to these moral decisions and cognitions, and how are these then affected by the environments that we make through our biology, our sociology, our machination? How do the arrows go both ways? I see great hope for science. I also see great hope for ethics, but I don't see great hope for either of them unless they work in tandem and integration. That by itself isn't just a project, that's a program. That's a paradigm shift.